Torrance, California, September 1993. A converted warehouse on the eastern edge of the city, the kind of building that had no sign above the door and no windows facing the street. Inside, the mats were gray and salt, worn from 10,000 hours of grinding. The fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency just below language. 41 students sat or stood along 3 walls, their gis damp, their postures careful. They had been invited to watch something that was not a competition and not a class. At the center of the room stood Royce Gracie. He was 26 years old, 6 feet and 1 inch tall, 178 pounds, which did not look like much until you watched him move. He had already fought in the first Ultimate Fighting Championship 8 months earlier, in Denver, and he had walked out of that cage unbeaten, having submitted 3 men in one night from 3 different disciplines. A boxer, a kickboxer, a wrestler. He had not been touched in any meaningful way by any of them. The Brazilian jiu-jitsu community called what he did that night a demonstration. Everyone else called it a revelation. He was now the most credentialed submission fighter in the United States, possibly the world, and every serious martial artist on the West Coast knew his name and respected the weight of it. 12 seconds after the challenge was issued that afternoon, the gym fell silent in a way that 41 experienced fighters would spend the rest of their careers struggling to describe. Not one person in that building understood what they had just seen. Not yet. The understanding would come later, in pieces, over the following weeks and months, passed from dojo to dojo and gym to gym, gathering detail in some tellings and losing it in others, until the story arrived, stripped of all excess, at its essential truth. Nobody in that room knew they were about to witness the most important 12 seconds of Chuck Norris's public martial arts life. He was sitting in the 4th row of folding chairs along the north wall. He had arrived early, alone, wearing dark jeans, a plain gray pullover, and a pair of canvas training shoes with no logo visible. His hair was short and unremarkable. He had a coffee cup in his right hand, and he was watching Royce Gracie demonstrate a rear naked choke entry on a student twice his own weight, with the attentiveness of someone who had not yet decided whether he agreed with what he was seeing. To the students who noticed him at all, he looked like someone's older uncle who had come to pick someone up and decided to wait inside. Chuck Norris was 53 years old. He held an 8th-degree black belt in Tang Soo Do. He was a former middleweight karate champion across 3 consecutive years at a time when winning once was considered an achievement of uncommon rarity. He had trained personally under Bruce Lee for portions of a year and considered those sessions the most instructive of his life. He had been inducted into the Black Belt Hall of Fame. He had opened his own system, Chun Kuk Do, with 600 schools operating under that name across the country by that year. He was also the star of a television program called Walker, Texas Ranger, which was in its 3rd season and averaging 11 million viewers per episode on Friday nights. None of that was visible in the gray pullover and the canvas shoes. Royce Gracie had just finished the demonstration. He was accepting a question from a student near the south wall when his brother Rickson, who was standing to his right, said something quietly in Portuguese. Royce turned his head. He looked at the 4th row. He looked for a long moment. Then he crossed the mat in 15 paces and stopped in front of the folding chair. He said, "You are Chuck Norris." Chuck Norris said, "I am." Royce Gracie said, "Your karate would never work in MMA." The room went very still. It was not a question. It was not offered as the opening of a conversation. It was a statement issued publicly, in front of 41 witnesses, with the confidence of a man who had spent the previous 8 months being proven right about most things he had stated publicly. He was not wrong to have the confidence. That is important to understand. Royce Gracie had earned the right to believe what he believed. What he had done inside that cage in Denver was real and verifiable, and had changed, permanently, the way fighters and coaches and promoters thought about combat sports in America. When he said that a traditional martial art would not survive inside an open-rules environment, he was citing evidence. His certainty, however, was complete, and complete certainty, in a fighting context, is an engineering problem. If you are watching this, and you understand how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed right now, and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. Because what happened in the next 12 seconds belongs to everyone who studies this art seriously. Chuck Norris set the coffee cup on the seat of the chair beside him. He did not stand up quickly. He did not check his shoes or adjust his collar or roll his neck to one side. He set the cup down with deliberate placement, handle facing inward, and he rose from the chair in one motion that used no visible effort. He unzipped the gray pullover and folded it once across the back of the chair. Sleeves inward, the way a man folds something he expects to pick up again. He walked to the edge of the mat in 7 steps and removed his canvas shoes without untying them, setting them side by side, toes pointing toward the wall. He stood on the mat in a white t-shirt and dark jeans, bare feet flat on the salt-worn gray surface. The 41 students along the walls had gone completely quiet. One of them, a brown belt named David Okafor, who had trained in wrestling at the collegiate level before coming to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, would say years later that the quality of the silence that entered the room when Chuck Norris stepped onto the mat was specific. It was not the silence of surprise or of expectation. It was the silence, Okafor said, of people who were suddenly unsure which way something was going to fall. Chuck Norris looked at Royce Gracie from a distance of 9 feet and said nothing. He has already lost. He simply does not know it yet. A fight is not one man striking another. A fight is a question about distance and who controls the answer. At 9 feet, everything is a negotiation. At 9 feet, the striker has the first word. At 7 feet, the answer gets complicated. At 3 feet, the conversation belongs entirely to the man who has spent his life learning what happens in the space where arms cannot fully extend. Royce Gracie understood 3 feet better than almost anyone alive. Chuck Norris understood 7 feet in a way that Royce Gracie had not yet had occasion to study. What happened in the next 12 seconds was not a competition and not a demonstration. It was a question asked at full speed and answered in the same register. Second one. Royce Gracie moved forward. He moved the way he always moved, low at the hips, his weight distributed across both feet in equal measure, his hands open and forward, closing the distance in a measured advance that had worked without modification against every man he had tested it against in the previous 8 months. He covered 4 feet in a single step. At the south wall, Royce Gracie took 1 step forward and stopped. Second 2. Chuck Norris did not retreat. He did not set his stance wider or bring his guard higher. He turned 16 degrees to his left. 16 degrees is not visible from the 4th row of folding chairs. It is barely visible from 3 feet away. What it does, at that exact angle, is rotate the lead hip backward by precisely enough to change the geometry of what Royce Gracie was reaching for. The tournament director, a man named Paul Harrington, who had been running regional judo and jiu-jitsu competitions on the West Coast for 11 years, was standing at the east wall with his arms folded. He unfolded them. Second 3. Royce Gracie's right hand reached the space where Chuck Norris's left hip had been. It found nothing. Royce Gracie was experienced enough that this did not cause him to overcommit. He recognized the miss in real time and began the adjustment. Second 4. Chuck Norris's left hand moved, not in an arc, not in a technique that has a name in any traditional curriculum. It moved in a line, deflecting Royce Gracie's right forearm outward by 4 inches. 4 inches in a grappling entry is the difference between the grip you intended and the grip that does not work. Royce Gracie felt the deflection and understood its meaning immediately. David Okafor, at the north wall, stopped breathing for a moment. Second 5. The distance between the two men was now 3.5 feet. This was Royce Gracie's distance, or should have been. He launched his second entry, a double-leg attempt with a level change that had dropped men 60 pounds heavier than Chuck Norris onto their backs inside a cage in front of an audience of 12,000 people. The level change hit air. Second 6. Chuck Norris had moved laterally, 2 feet to his right, without crossing his feet. This is a thing that is practiced for years before it becomes available in a moment of actual speed. The footwork has a name in Tang Sudo that translates roughly as the stepping of water, which means moving without disturbing the surface. His feet did not make a sound on the mat. Paul Harrington put both hands flat on the table behind him. Second 7. Royce Gracie came up from the failed level change and pivoted. He was still composed. This is important to note. His technique had missed twice, but his composure had not broken. He turned and faced Chuck Norris from a distance of 4 feet, and for the first time in the sequence he paused for a fraction of a second to recalibrate. The fraction of a second is everything in this art. Second 8. Chuck Norris moved forward. For the first time in 8 seconds, he moved toward rather than away. He closed the 4 feet to 18 inches in a single step, and his right hand extended in a palm heel strike, aimed at a point on Royce Gracie's sternum, approximately 3 inches below the collarbone. It was moving at a speed that Paul Harrington, who had watched fighters throw techniques at speed for 11 years, would later estimate at roughly 70% of what a man of that size could generate. At 70%, it was fast enough. Second 9. The strike stopped. It stopped with the heel of Chuck Norris's palm 1 inch from Royce Gracie's sternum. 1 inch of clearance. The arm was fully extended. The weight behind it was real and committed. The gymnasium produced no sound. Second 10. Royce Gracie looked down at the hand in front of his chest. He looked at it for a full second. In 10 years of training and 3 years of competition, he had not been beaten to the moment in quite this way. He was familiar with losing. He came from a family that had built an entire philosophy out of the losing sequences, the positions that were already bad, the escapes from failure. He was not afraid of being beaten. He was surprised. That is the correct word. Second 11. Chuck Norris withdrew the hand. Slowly, he stepped back 1 pace, returning the distance between them to 5 feet. He let his arms fall to his sides. He was breathing at approximately the same rate as he had been when he walked onto the mat. Royce Gracie raised his eyes from the space where the hand had been and looked at him. Second 12. Chuck Norris said nothing. The gymnasium was completely silent. This is the moment that 41 students and 2 professional fighters and 1 tournament director would attempt to describe for the rest of their lives with varying degrees of success. The silence was not the silence of a victory or a defeat. It was the silence that follows a proof. In mathematics, when a proof is correct, it does not require argument. It sits there, complete, and the room either understands it or it does not. Royce Gracie understood it. he stood at his fork in the road. On one side was the thing that pride offers in moments like this, which is a technical explanation, a context, a list of what the mat would have decided if the hand had connected and the situation had continued. Every person in that gymnasium had heard that speech before. Many of them had given it. On the other side was the truth, as the 12 seconds had demonstrated it. Royce Gracie chose the truth. He said, in a voice that was not raised, "Show me that footwork." Chuck Norris nodded once. He extended his right hand, open, palm upward, which is not a standard ending to any technique in the Tang Soo Do curriculum. It is a gesture that belongs to no system. Royce Gracie looked at it for a moment, and then took it. The shoulder touch came from Paul Harrington, who crossed the gymnasium floor when the two men separated and put one hand briefly on Chuck Norris's left shoulder as he walked toward the folding chairs. He did not say anything. The touch confirmed something that words in that moment would have diminished. David Okafor would say, years later, that the private sentence was the thing he thought about most. The thing that Chuck Norris leaned in and said to Royce Gracie in the moment before he retrieved his pullover from the back of the chair. It was spoken at a distance of 6 inches, in a voice that no one else in the gymnasium could hear. And Royce Gracie would not repeat it in any interview for 11 years. When he finally mentioned it, in a podcast in 2004, he said only that it was the most instructive single sentence he had ever been given about distance, and that he had built a portion of his later teaching around its meaning. He did not repeat the sentence. Some things belong to the moment that produced them. The story left that gymnasium in 17 separate directions. By October of that year, a version of it had reached a dojo in Osaka that had no direct connection to either man. By January of 1994, Paul Harrington had told it at 3 separate regional competitions, and it had arrived at each one already altered, growing in some particulars and contracting in others, the way all true stories do when they pass through enough careful mouths. In some versions, the footwork sequence was longer. In some versions, the pull was 2 inches rather than 1. In one version that circulated briefly in the Pacific Northwest, the entire encounter lasted 30 seconds. The 41 students knew what they had seen. They disagreed on the details and agreed on the weight of it. Royce Gracie changed his curriculum that year. Not dramatically, not in a way that produced a press release or a formal announcement. He began adding a section to his striking defense work that dealt specifically with oblique movement, lateral repositioning, the management of the distance between 4 feet and 7 feet where a grappler has not yet secured control and a striker has not yet lost it. His students noticed the addition. He did not explain its origin. Chuck Norris continued production on Walker Texas Ranger through 2001. He continued teaching Chun Kuk Do. He did not give interviews about that afternoon in Torrance. He did not post about it. He did not reference it in any public context. He folded his pullover back across his shoulders when he left, sleeves inward, and he walked out through the same door he had come in. The fluorescent lights continued buzzing at their frequency just below language. The gray mats held their shape under 41 pairs of feet, returning to positions on the floor. Somewhere on the eastern side of the city, a forklift was moving cargo between 2 buildings in the flat afternoon light, indifferent to everything that had happened on the other side of a wall, with no sign above the door. What a man knows, and what he can demonstrate at speed, are different things. What a style can prove in a controlled environment, and what it can prove in the 12 seconds a situation actually gives you, are different things. The greatest mistake a trained man can make is to confuse familiarity with mastery, because the universe consistently tests the second and never the first. Royce Gracie knew this by the time he walked out of that gymnasium. He had known a version of it for years. What he carried out that afternoon was a more precise version, arrived at through a method that cannot be scheduled or replicated. That precision cost 12 seconds. Next week we turn to the story of Bruce Lee and a film set in Hong Kong where a stunt coordinator with a point to prove picked the wrong afternoon to test a theory. That episode carries details that have not been in print in any form. We will be there.